Tonight, these dramatic new images show an 18-year-old hurling a homemade bomb in what police say was meant to be a terror attack bigger than the Boston Marathon bombing. Another teen then hands him a second device. He ignites it, sprints down a sidewalk, hops a police barricade, and is tackled while the device is still smoking. This chaos interrupted dueling protests Saturday outside the home of New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, started by far-right anti-Muslim provocateur Jake Lang.
The violent left does not respect freedom of speech.
Police say 18-year-old Emir Balat and 19-year-old Ibrahim Kayumi drove from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and told investigators they were inspired by ISIS.
This was not random violence. This was a planned attack motivated by extremist ideology and inspired by a violent foreign terrorist organization.
The FBI says one of the teens watched ISIS propaganda videos on his phone, and the other told them he wanted to carry out an attack bigger than the Boston Marathon bombing and lamented that attack caused only 3 deaths. The devices were made from mason jars, nuts, and bolts. One of them tested positive for the highly volatile substance TATP, used in attacks around the world.
Make no mistake, what happened this weekend was incredibly dangerous.
An attack outside the home of the city's mayor is currently being investigated as an ISIS-inspired act of terror. It all happened during dueling protests over the weekend. 2 men seen throwing improvised explosive devices, and one of those devices was lit.
They were improvised explosive devices that could have caused serious injury or death. We were fortunate that the devices used this weekend did not cause the kind of harm that they were certainly capable of causing.
The 2 men, one just 18 years old, the other 19, are now in federal custody. They're both from Pennsylvania, where their homes were searched. The investigation continued Sunday when authorities searched the vehicle the men allegedly drove and discovered another suspicious device. Officers evacuated nearby buildings while the bomb squad removed it for further testing. NBC News national law correspondent Tom Winter joins us now. So, Tom, the officials directly investigating this right now are saying that the suspects referred to ISIS during interrogations. Walk us through what happened here.
Yeah, that's our reporting. By the way, a couple of updates just in the moment. It took me to come down from my office to speak with you all. Balat is expected to be in federal court shortly. We should get the charging documents for both of these individuals here within the next hour or so. And then that device that you mentioned, we saw the robot there pulling at the door of that car. That device has since been tested, has found out not to have an explosive. So that was a container that they were certainly concerned about, but it turns out that there's not going to be an explosive inside of there. Yes, to your point in question there, Vicky, obviously this is a concerning case. We are told, according to multiple people that have been briefed on this investigation, that one of these individuals directly referenced ISIS, and it appears that they have, and we're still waiting, as I said, on the charging documents, but our reporting is, based on a number of people we've spoken to, these individuals appear to have an issue with the fact that they thought their religion was being targeted by this far-right protester who is speaking outside of Gracie Mansion, so that there's some sort of a nexus there. How strong that is, we'll see, but obviously, given the type of explosive and the device, very concerning.
On a tense Saturday afternoon outside Gracie Mansion, where chants, anger, and political fury were already colliding in the street, something far more dangerous was allegedly moving through the crowd. What began as a chaotic confrontation between demonstrators and counter-protesters would, within hours, become the center of a federal terrorism case after authorities said 2 young men from Pennsylvania brought improvised explosive devices to one of the most symbolically sensitive locations in New York City. According to investigators, one device was thrown, another was ignited and dropped, and both failed to explode. But officials say the outcome could have been catastrophic. Police say the explosives were not harmless props, not empty threats, and not random objects mistaken in the confusion of a protest. Investigators said at least one device tested positive for TATP, a highly volatile explosive so dangerous it has earned the nickname Mother of Satan. Authorities say the device also contained materials that could have turned it into a deadly weapon if it had detonated in a crowd. In a city where public protests are common and political tensions often spill into the streets, officials say this scene crossed into something far more chilling. An alleged ISIS-inspired terror plot unfolding in broad daylight outside the New York mayor's residence. Now, federal prosecutors say the 2 men at the center of the case are 18-year-old Emir Balat and 19-year-old Ibrahim Kayumi. Both have been charged in a 5-count federal complaint that includes terrorism-related allegations, such as attempting to provide material support to ISIS and use of a weapon of mass destruction. Authorities say the case did not end with the scene at Gracie Mansion. Investigators continued searching homes, a vehicle, and additional locations tied to the suspects, trying to determine whether this was a failed act of violence by two individuals alone or part of something broader and more disturbing. And then came the allegations that made the story even darker. According to court papers cited by federal authorities and major news outlets, Kayumi allegedly told police he was affiliated with ISIS, had watched ISIS propaganda on his phone, and was partly inspired by the terrorist group. Prosecutors also say Balat made an even more alarming statement, allegedly saying they wanted to carry out an attack bigger than the Boston Marathon bombing. Those are allegations, not proven facts, but they transformed the case from a shocking protest incident into one of the most disturbing terrorism investigations New York has seen in years. What makes this case especially unsettling is not only the alleged motive, but the setting. Investigators have said Mayor Zoran Mamdani and his wife were not believed to be the targets, and the mayor was reportedly away at the time. But the location still mattered. Gracie Mansion is not just another building in Manhattan. It is a symbol of the city's leadership, a place already surrounded that day by tension, ideology, outrage, and heavy police presence. In that environment, officials say two homemade explosive devices were allegedly brought into the chaos, and only luck, quick police action, or a failed detonation may have prevented a far deadlier outcome. Tonight, the questions are bigger than the devices themselves. Who were these two young men before this moment? How did prosecutors come to believe this was inspired by ISIS? What exactly happened in those critical seconds outside Gracie Mansion? And how close did New York come to witnessing a mass casualty attack in the middle of a political protest? This is the story of a plot authorities say could have changed the city in an instant, and of the evidence, the allegations, and the unanswered questions now driving a federal case that has shocked the nation. By the time the first chance rose outside Gracie Mansion that Saturday, New York was already bracing for confrontation. The location alone made the gathering volatile. Gracie Mansion is not just another address on the Upper East Side. It is the official residence of the New York City mayor, a place loaded with symbolism, power, and public attention. On March 7, 2026, that space became the setting for dueling protest energy as a far-right anti-Islam demonstration led by activist Jake Lang drew a counter-protest nearby. Officials later said more than 100 counter-protesters were present, along with a heavy police presence and growing tension in the street. What began as noise, anger, and political theater would soon become something much darker. Authorities say two young men had traveled from Pennsylvania into that atmosphere carrying something far more dangerous than signs or slogans. Their names, according to federal prosecutors, were Emir Balat, 18, and Ibrahim Kayumi, 19. At first glance, they might have blended into the chaos of the crowd the way so many people do during a demonstration, faces half hidden by movement, voices lost inside a wave of chants, everyone appearing to be just one more body in a city used to public unrest. But investigators now allege they arrived with improvised explosive devices, and that the confusion of the protest may have given them the exact cover they needed to move close enough to act. To understand why the scene mattered, you have to picture the mood of that day. This was not a quiet civic gathering. Reporting describes a charged confrontation between demonstrators and counter-demonstrators outside the mayor's home, a setting already sensitive because of the city's political climate, and because Zoran Mamdani is New York's first Muslim mayor. Protests centered on anti-Muslim rhetoric had already drawn outrage, and officials later made clear that while the mayor and his wife were not believed to be the targets, the environment outside Gracie Mansion had become an especially combustible place for any act of violence. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. A protest framed around Islam, outside the residence of a Muslim mayor in one of the most watched cities in the world. Then came the moment that changed the story from protest disorder to a federal terrorism case. Prosecutors say one of the devices was thrown into the crowd and failed to explode. Another was allegedly ignited and then dropped near police officers, but it also did not detonate. In those seconds, the danger may not have been immediately obvious to everyone nearby. In a loud protest, a sudden object thrown through the air can be mistaken for many things: a bottle, a can, debris, some random act of anger. But investigators would soon say this was no ordinary projectile, no improvised scare tactic meant only to startle. At least one of the objects, they said, was an actual improvised explosive device. The most chilling part of this chapter is how close the scene may have come to catastrophe without the crowd fully realizing it in real time. Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch said the device could have caused serious injury or death. Federal authorities say the recovered explosive tested positive for TATP, a highly unstable chemical compound used in terrorist attacks around the world. It is so volatile that even handling it can be dangerous. Reports say the device also contained screws, bolts, or similar metal components that could have acted as shrapnel if the bomb had exploded among protesters or officers. In other words, investigators are not describing a crude prank or failed stunt. They are describing an alleged weapon capable of tearing through a packed public scene. That is what makes the silence afterwards so eerie. Because the devices did not detonate, the city was spared the images that would have instantly burned themselves into public memory: blood on the pavement, shoes left behind in panic, sirens colliding with screams, and the awful confusion that follows a mass casualty blast. Instead, there was something more unsettling in its own way: the realization that all of that may have been seconds away, and that the only reason it did not happen may have been mechanical failure, unstable chemistry, or a quick police response. In many terror investigations, the worst horror arrives first and the evidence comes later. Here, prosecutors say the evidence came first, and the horror was what might have happened. Investigators moved fast. Balat was apprehended at the scene after allegedly attempting to deploy one of the devices, according to federal authorities and major reporting. Kayumi was also taken into custody. No one was killed. No one was physically wounded by an explosion because no explosion occurred. But the arrests did not calm the situation. They deepened it, because once police and federal investigators began examining what had been recovered, the case widened almost immediately. This was no longer just about what had happened in front of officers and demonstrators. It was about what else the two men might have brought with them, what they had said, what they believed, where they had been before arriving in Manhattan, and whether there were more devices or more plans beyond what the street had already revealed. That broader fear sharpened when authorities found a third suspicious device in a vehicle connected to the suspects on East End Avenue. Reporting indicates that object later did not test positive for explosives, but its discovery added to the urgency of the investigation. Even if the third device was not explosive, its presence in a vehicle tied to the suspects suggested this was not a one-object incident unfolding by chance in a burst of emotion. It suggested preparation. It suggested transport. It suggested a plan with multiple components, even if parts of that plan failed or never reached the point investigators say was intended. The federal complaint that followed would allege exactly that kind of seriousness. Prosecutors charged the two men in a 5-count federal case that included attempting to provide material support to ISIS and use of a weapon of mass destruction. Those are not routine charges attached to public disorder. They are among the most severe allegations the government can bring in a terrorism investigation. The language itself changes the way the story must be understood. A bad protest incident is one thing. A failed bombing allegation tied to the Islamic State is something else entirely. When the complaint became public, what had looked like a chaotic but localized act outside Gracie Mansion suddenly took on national security weight. And then the alleged motive emerged, turning the fear surrounding the case into something even more disturbing. According to court papers cited by federal prosecutors and multiple news organizations, Kayumi allegedly told police that he was affiliated with ISIS, had watched ISIS propaganda on his phone, and was partly inspired by the group. Prosecutors also say Balat allegedly stated that they wanted an attack bigger than the Boston Marathon bombing, and referred to that earlier bombing as causing only 3 deaths. These allegations have not been proven in court, and both men remain defendants, not convicted terrorists. But if those alleged statements are accurate, they reveal a level of ambition and ideological alignment that goes far beyond anger at a protest or a spontaneous political clash. They suggest, at minimum, that investigators believe the violence was meant to send a message far larger than the crowd outside Gracie Mansion. For the people who had gathered that day, none of those alleged motives would have been visible in the moment. What they would have felt instead was confusion, adrenaline, and the strange unreality that often follows a near disaster before everyone understands how close they came. There is a particular kind of dread that arrives only later, after the footage is replayed, after the officers speak, after the prosecutors file papers, after experts explain what TATP can do. It is the dread of hindsight. The dread of discovering that an event you thought was merely tense had, according to investigators, contained the ingredients for something much worse. In that sense, the true shock of Gracie Mansion did not happen only on the street. It happened after the street cleared, when the facts began to come into focus. The public statements that followed tried to capture that gravity. Mayor Mamdani said plainly that anyone who comes to New York City to bring violence to its streets will be held accountable under the law. He also made clear that he and his wife had not been home at the time and were not considered the intended targets. That clarification matters because it shifts the focus from an assassination narrative to something broader and more chilling, an alleged attempt to bring ideological violence into a crowded, emotionally charged public scene. Mamdani also praised the officers who responded, saying they moved toward danger so others could move away from it. In a case full of inflammatory allegations and political symbolism, that detail matters too. It reminds us that the line between a failed plot and a successful mass attack can sometimes be measured in seconds and in human reaction. By the time Balat and Kayumi appeared in federal court, the image of the case had already taken shape. 2 young men in custody, white Tyvek suits, shackles. No plea entered at that brief appearance. A magistrate ordering both held without bail. One defense attorney reportedly saying of his 18-year-old client that he did not know what he was doing. And outside the courtroom, a city trying to absorb the fact that the latest terror investigation in New York had not begun with a subway station or a landmark tower, but with a protest outside the mayor's residence where a homemade explosive allegedly moved through a crowd and failed to detonate. The unanswered questions only multiplied. How long had the 2 men been planning this? Did they radicalize together or separately? Had they met long before the protest, or only recently, as one lawyer suggested? Were there signs online, in travel, in communications, or in purchases that could have foreshadowed what prosecutors now allege happened in Manhattan? The FBI widened its investigation quickly, searching homes and a Pennsylvania storage unit, while recovered materials were sent for deeper forensic testing. That kind of follow-up does not happen in a case investigators believe is fully understood in the first hours. It happens when authorities suspect the street scene was only the visible edge of a larger story. Not with the throw of a device, not with an arrest, not even with the filing of charges, but with a city facing a more unsettling possibility. Because according to prosecutors, what happened outside Gracie Mansion was not merely a protest spiraling out of control. It was the alleged opening move of an ISIS-inspired act of terror that failed not because the intent was small, but because the devices did not do what they were meant to do. the crowd went home. The mayor's residence stood untouched. The headlines spread across the country. But behind those headlines, agents were already digging deeper into who Emir Balat and Ibrahim Kayumi really were, what they had brought into New York, and whether the plan that failed on the street was only part of what they had imagined. And once investigators began looking beyond the protest itself, the story became even darker. The deeper investigators looked, the more unsettling the case became. What had begun as a shocking street incident outside Gracie Mansion was now opening into a far more complicated question. Who exactly were Emir Balat and Ibrahim Kayumi before that Saturday? And what had brought two young men from Pennsylvania into the middle of one of the most politically charged protest scenes in New York with alleged explosive devices in their possession? Federal prosecutors identified Balat as 18 and Kayumi as 19, and reporting from major outlets described Balat as a high school senior. That detail alone gave the case a disturbing contrast. One of the suspects was still young enough to be living in the rhythm of school life. Yet investigators were now accusing him of participating in an alleged terrorism plot involving ISIS-inspired ideology and improvised explosives. At first, there was no public record suggesting either man had been widely known as a threat. Reuters reported that neither suspect appeared to have a prior criminal record, which made the allegations feel even more jarring. In cases like this, the public often wants a clean, simple explanation. Some obvious warning sign, some visible trail of criminal behavior, some dramatic public declaration that would make the story feel less frightening in hindsight. But many investigations do not begin that way. Sometimes the most disturbing cases are the ones where the people at the center seem, at least on the surface, to have come from ordinary places and ordinary routines before allegedly stepping into something violent and ideological. That gap between appearance and accusation is where the fear grows. According to the federal complaint, Kayumi allegedly gave investigators one of the first direct clues into motive. Prosecutors say he told police he was affiliated with ISIS, that he had watched ISIS propaganda on his phone, and that he had been partly inspired by the group in carrying out his actions that day. Those are allegations, not proven facts, but they shifted the entire frame of the case. Once investigators say a suspect has invoked ISIS directly, the story no longer sits only inside local politics, protest violence, or disorderly conduct. It becomes a counterterrorism case, with all the fear, scrutiny, and national attention that follow. And in New York, that label carries a long memory. The city has lived with the shadow of terror plots before, and each new allegation arrives with echoes of older trauma. Then came the allegation that would dominate headlines and define the menace of the case. Prosecutors say Balat allegedly told authorities they wanted to carry out an attack bigger than the Boston Marathon bombing. That alleged statement is central not just because of what it says about intent, but because of how coldly it frames the ambition behind the act. The Boston Marathon bombing remains one of the most infamous terror attacks in modern America, not only because of the deaths and injuries, but because of the chaos, panic, and raw vulnerability it exposed in a crowded public place. For investigators to say a suspect referenced that attack as a benchmark made the Gracie Mansion case feel even more alarming. It suggested that what failed on the sidewalk may not reflect the scale of what prosecutors believe was imagined in the suspects' minds. As agents began building that picture, the investigation expanded beyond the scene of the protest itself. Authorities searched homes linked to the suspects and also widened the probe to a storage unit in Pennsylvania. That is a significant detail, because it suggests investigators believe the evidence trail did not begin and end with the devices recovered in Manhattan. When federal agents start searching additional locations, they are usually trying to answer a chain of urgent questions. Were more materials stored elsewhere? Were there notes, messages, or research showing a longer planning period? Did the suspects travel with everything they needed, or had they assembled parts in different places over time? Every new search signals that the government is looking for the architecture behind the alleged plot, not just the most visible fragments of it. The devices themselves remained central to that search for answers. Authorities said at least one of the objects tested positive for TATP, a dangerously unstable explosive known in some reporting as Mother of Satan. Police said the IED had been packed with screws, bolts, and other metal pieces that could have become deadly shrapnel if the device had detonated in the crowd. This matters because explosive cases are sometimes clouded by exaggeration, politics, or confusion at the scene. But in this case, officials were explicit. They were not describing a fake bomb, a smoke device, or a harmless object mistaken for something sinister. They were describing a real improvised explosive capable of causing serious injury or death. That technical detail gave prosecutors something more concrete than rhetoric. It gave them a physical basis for the severity of the charges. And the charges were severe. Federal prosecutors filed a 5-count complaint that included attempting to provide material support to ISIS, use of a weapon of mass destruction, and other terrorism-related offenses, including unlawful transport of explosives in some coverage. Those are charges that transform the public understanding of an event. Once the federal government frames a case that way, the language itself carries weight. This is no longer being treated as a spontaneous outburst at a protest. It is being treated as an alleged deliberate effort to carry out ideological violence using explosives in support of a foreign terrorist organization. Even before any trial, those allegations change the emotional scale of the story. They tell the public that investigators believe the risk was not symbolic. It was potentially catastrophic. The image of the suspects in custody only added to the unease surrounding the case. Reporting described both young men appearing in court in white Tyvek suits, seated at the same defense table but separated by their attorneys, shackled, and saying little. They did not enter pleas at that initial appearance, and a federal magistrate ordered them held without bail. The visual detail is hard to shake. 2 teenagers, silent and restrained, at the center of allegations involving ISIS, improvised bombs, and a failed attack outside the mayor's residence. In documentary storytelling, moments like that often land harder than speeches or headlines because they compress the surreal reality of the case into one frame. Youth, silence, shackles, federal court. The gap between age and accusation becomes impossible to ignore. One of Balat's lawyers reportedly argued that his client was only 18 and did not know what he was doing. That is the kind of defense statement that opens another layer of the story, not because it resolves anything, but because it asks the audience to confront a different question. How does someone that young end up accused in a terrorism case of this scale? Was this a story of ideological grooming, online radicalization, mutual escalation between 2 young men, or something else entirely? The law will eventually test the evidence. But for now, the public is left with a pattern investigators often see in extremism cases: individuals whose age makes the allegations more shocking, not less. The defense can point to immaturity. Prosecutors can point to intent. And the tension between those 2 narratives becomes part of the drama of the case itself. There was also the matter of how the suspects allegedly presented themselves after arrest. Local reporting said Balat appeared to make a hand gesture interpreted as showing support for ISIS while being led from a precinct. That detail is not as foundational as the statements in the complaint, and it should be treated carefully, because the core prosecution rests more heavily on the court documents and physical evidence than on a gesture caught on camera. Still, in the public imagination, images often matter as much as allegations. A glance, a symbol, a motion of the hand, these become visual shorthand for a suspect's mindset, whether fairly or unfairly. In a case already charged with ideology, religion, and fear, even a brief gesture can intensify the sense that this was not merely an act of protest violence, but something rooted in extremist allegiance. Another unsettling piece of the investigation involved travel and wider background questions. Some coverage reported that investigators were examining whether the suspects had any broader connections, including recent travel, though no public evidence has established that this was part of a larger operational network. That distinction is important. At this stage, the most solid facts point to two men, two primary devices deployed at the protest, a third suspicious device in a vehicle that reportedly did not test positive for explosives, and an ongoing forensic and digital investigation. But in the early phases of terrorism cases, uncertainty itself becomes part of the suspense. Authorities have to ask whether others were involved, whether there were additional targets, and whether the failed act on one afternoon was meant to be the beginning of something wider. Meanwhile, officials were also trying to calm the broader city without minimizing the danger. Mayor Zoran Mamdani said plainly that anyone who brought violence to New York streets would be held accountable. He also emphasized that he and his wife were not believed to be targets and had been away at the time of the incident. Governor Kathy Hochul said National Guard personnel were patrolling sensitive locations around the city, while law enforcement made clear the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force were deeply involved. These statements served two purposes at once. They reassured the public that the government was responding aggressively, and they acknowledged that the allegations were serious enough to justify a full-scale counterterrorism response. In a city as symbolically loaded as New York, those words carry enormous weight. But perhaps the darkest question hanging over the case was not what happened outside Gracie Mansion. It was what did not happen. If prosecutors are right, the devices failed to detonate, and that failure may be the only reason this story did not become a mass casualty bombing scene replayed around the world. That possibility changes the emotional gravity of every later detail. The searches, the statements, the ISIS allegations, the court appearance, the lab testing in Quantico, all of it sits under the shadow of a single fact. According to authorities, New York may have come frighteningly close to something much worse than the public saw in real time. This was not a city grieving a completed attack. It was a city trying to absorb a near miss. And yet, even with all of those details, investigators still did not have the full story. They had names, charges, recovered evidence, and alarming statements in the complaint. But they were still working to understand how two young men had allegedly moved from ideology to action, from propaganda to possession, from belief to an attempted public attack. That gap between radical ideas and violent execution is where the next phase of the story becomes even more disturbing. Because as agents kept digging into phones, locations, statements, and materials, they were no longer just investigating what happened on March 7. They were trying to reconstruct the road that led there. And that road, they suspected, may have begun long before anyone in Manhattan saw a device fly through the air. The case no longer looked like a single failed act in the chaos of a protest. It looked like the surface of something more deliberate, an alleged plot shaped by extremist influence, carried into New York from another state, and interrupted before it could become the kind of tragedy that permanently scars a city. But the most important pieces of the story were still ahead. How prosecutors say the suspects prepared, what investigators found in the evidence trail, and whether the failed attack outside Gracie Mansion was the full plan or only the part that went wrong in public. As the federal case moved forward, the most frightening part of the Gracie Mansion story was no longer just what happened in the street. It was what investigators believed those few violent seconds represented. By then, the public already knew the outline. Two young men from Pennsylvania, Emir Balat, 18, and Ibrahim Kayumi, 19, accused of bringing improvised explosive devices to a protest outside the New York mayor's residence. One device allegedly thrown, another allegedly ignited and dropped, both failing to explode. No casualties reported. But the deeper law enforcement response suggested that, in the government's view, this was never being treated as a small or isolated outburst. The FBI widened its inquiry. Searches continued in Pennsylvania. and the recovered materials were being examined to determine not just what was used, but how far the planning may have gone before the suspects ever arrived in Manhattan. That widening investigation matters because it tells you how authorities were reading the danger. In many cases, once suspects are in custody and the immediate scene is secured, the public narrative begins to calm. Here, it seemed to do the opposite. Reports said the FBI searched a Pennsylvania storage unit linked to the investigation, while law enforcement also examined homes and a vehicle tied to the suspects. A third suspicious device recovered from a car connected to the men reportedly did not test positive for explosives, but its existence still added another layer to the case. It suggested movement, preparation, transport, and the possibility that what unfolded at Gracie Mansion was only the visible portion of a larger plan. Even if the third item turned out not to be explosive, investigators were clearly trying to determine whether the two men had brought more to New York than the public had first understood. The forensic side of the case only deepened that concern. Authorities said at least one recovered device tested positive for TATP, a highly volatile explosive used in prior terrorist attacks and commonly described as dangerously unstable. Police also said the device was packed with metal items such as nuts, bolts, and screws, materials that could have turned the blast into a shrapnel attack if detonation had occurred in a crowd. That detail is not just technical. It changes the emotional weight of the entire story. The protest outside Gracie Mansion was already packed with tension, ideology, anger, and bodies standing close together. If investigators are right about the contents of the device, then the scene was not simply threatened by noise or disorder. It was allegedly inches from becoming a mass casualty event. And that is where the real horror of this case lives, in the distance between what happened and what could have happened. New York did not wake up to footage of a successful bombing outside the mayor's residence. It woke up to a failed attempt and then had to grapple with the possibility that failure itself was the only thing standing between the city and a far worse headline. In terror investigations, we often focus on the explosion, the fatalities, the visible damage. But a failed plot can carry a different kind of fear because it forces the public to imagine the alternate outcome. The sidewalk remains intact. The crowd disperses. No smoke fills the air, and yet officials say the danger was real all the same. What the city faced, according to prosecutors, was not a symbolic threat but an alleged operational attempt that simply did not work as intended. That fear became even sharper because of the motive described in the complaint. Federal authorities say both men made statements after their arrests linking themselves to ISIS-inspired ideology. Prosecutors allege Kayumi said he was affiliated with ISIS, had watched ISIS propaganda on his phone, and had been partly inspired by the group. They also allege that Balat said they wanted an attack even bigger than the Boston Marathon bombing. Those allegations remain unproven until tested in court, but they explain why the government framed the case so aggressively from the start. This was not filed as a generic explosives case. It was charged as an alleged terrorism plot involving attempted support for a foreign terrorist organization and use of a weapon of mass destruction. Once that frame was established, the case stopped being just about one protest and became a story about radicalization, ideology, and how quickly violent intent can move from private belief into public action. There is another reason the story hits so hard: the ages of the suspects. Reuters and AP both emphasize that Balat was 18 and Kayumi 19, with Balat described as a high school senior. Neither man was widely reported to have a prior criminal record. That combination, youth, no obvious long public trail, and then sudden involvement in a federal terrorism case, makes the narrative feel especially unsettling. It invites the questions people always ask after these cases. How does someone that young end up here? What happened in the months before the alleged attack? Was this online radicalization, social influence, personal grievance, ideological obsession, or some mixture of all three? Those questions matter not just because they are dramatic, but because they point to the broader fear behind the headlines. If two teenagers can allegedly move toward violence of this kind with so little public warning, then the story becomes about vulnerability inside ordinary life, not just danger from an easily identified outsider. The court appearances did little to reduce that unease. Reports described both men appearing in federal court in white Tyvek suits, seated near each other but separated by counsel, shackled, and speaking only briefly. They did not enter pleas at that appearance, and a magistrate ordered them held without bail. One defense attorney said of Balat that he was 18 and had no idea what he was doing. That defense position may become important later if the case moves toward trial, plea negotiations, or arguments over intent and capacity. But in the public eye, the image was already fixed. Two very young defendants sitting in federal court at the center of allegations involving ISIS, homemade bombs, and a failed attack outside Gracie Mansion. For viewers of a documentary, that image becomes one of the emotional anchors of the story, because it compresses an entire national security narrative into a scene that feels almost impossible to reconcile. Meanwhile, the setting itself continued to shape how the case was understood. The protest scene outside Gracie Mansion was not random. Reuters reported that the gathering was tied to a far-right anti-Islam event led by Jake Lang and drew a substantial counter-protest. Mayor Zoran Mamdani, New York's first Muslim mayor, later made clear that he and his wife were not believed to be targets and were away at the time. That is an important factual distinction. The allegation was not that the suspects were specifically trying to assassinate the mayor. Instead, officials treated this as an act of violence brought into a highly symbolic, emotionally charged public setting near the mayor's residence during a confrontation already shaped by religion and politics. That context matters because it explains why the case immediately resonated beyond the mechanics of the devices themselves. It sat at the intersection of extremism, hate, public protest, and urban insecurity. Officials also had to manage the broader public response. Mayor Mamdani condemned the violence and said anyone who came to New York to bring violence to the streets would be held accountable. Governor Kathy Hochul said National Guard members were patrolling sensitive sites around the city, while the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force were involved in the ongoing inquiry. At the same time, Mamdani also defended the principle that even hateful speech does not justify violent retaliation. That tension between condemning an anti-Muslim protest and condemning the alleged bombing attempt even more forcefully was part of what made this story politically combustible. It was never just about two suspects. It was about the city's ability to hold the line between speech, outrage, security, and law when all four collide in the same place at the same time. For investigators, though, the key issue was more practical and more chilling, whether this was the full plot or only the part that failed in public. AP reported that agents were still trying to understand how the suspects allegedly became radicalized and whether others had any role. Reuters reported no evidence, at least at that point, tying the case to the ongoing conflict with Iran, but the investigation remained active. That distinction is important because a case can be ideologically inspired without being operationally directed from abroad. In some of the most disturbing modern cases, self-radicalized or loosely connected individuals absorb propaganda, fixate on symbols, and then attempt violence on their own timeline. If that is what investigators ultimately conclude happened here, then the Gracie Mansion case becomes part of a broader pattern that has troubled security officials for years. The threat of individuals who do not need large networks to become deadly. And yet there were still gaps in the public record, and those gaps are part of the suspense too. We do not fully know from the publicly reported facts so far how long the alleged planning lasted, how the suspects selected the protest, what conversations they had before traveling to New York, or whether the failed deployment reflected inexperience, device instability, or mere chance. We know prosecutors believe the intent was grave. We know the complaint alleges ISIS inspiration. We know at least one device was real and dangerous. But there is always a second story running beneath the visible one in cases like this. The hidden timeline. The searches, the forensic work, the digital evidence, the interviews, and the court filings are all attempts to reconstruct that hidden timeline and answer the question viewers always come back to. How did this begin? That is why the final meaning of the case extends beyond one afternoon outside Gracie Mansion. On one level, it is a story about a failed bombing attempt and two young defendants now facing extraordinary federal charges. On another level, it is about the anatomy of a near miss in a city that knows what terrorism looks like. New York has lived through successful attacks, attempted attacks, and plots interrupted at the last moment. Each one leaves behind a familiar set of questions about surveillance, radicalization, law enforcement readiness, and public vulnerability. This case now enters that history not because of the physical damage it caused, but because of the damage authorities say it might have caused had the devices functioned differently. The absence of an explosion did not erase the threat. It only changed the form of the aftermath. For a true crime documentary, that may be the most haunting truth of all. Some stories end in visible devastation. Others end in the cold realization that devastation was very nearly avoided. This case falls into the second category. It leaves behind no crater, no confirmed fatalities, no long casualty list. Instead, it leaves a chain of allegations, a set of dangerous recovered materials, a courtroom full of unanswered questions, and a city forced to consider how narrowly it may have escaped catastrophe. The crowd outside Gracie Mansion did not know, in those first frantic moments, exactly what was moving through the air around them. But prosecutors now say that what moved through that crowd was not random chaos. It was the alleged attempt to turn a protest into a terror scene. And that is where this story ultimately lands. Not with certainty, because the legal process is still ahead. Not with a conviction, because these are still allegations. But with a stark and deeply unsettling picture drawn by investigators. Two young men, inspired in part by ISIS propaganda, traveling from Pennsylvania to New York, arriving at a politically and religiously charged demonstration near the mayor's home, and allegedly deploying devices that could have caused serious injury or death if they had detonated. The federal case will now test every part of that account. It will test the evidence, the statements, the charges, and the timeline. But even now, before a verdict is ever reached, one thing is already clear. What happened outside Gracie Mansion was not just another ugly protest clash in a city used to public tension. According to the government, it was a failed act of terrorism that came far too close to succeeding. And in stories like this, sometimes the most terrifying part is not what the city saw. It is what the city almost had to see.